What if the delay you're frustrated by is actually proof that God is working? Right now, there may be something you've been praying for, an answer, a breakthrough, a healing, a door that refuses to open. And if you're honest, you're tired of waiting. You've prayed, you've trusted, you've tried to stay faithful, yet nothing seems to be changing. The silence feels heavy. The delay feels endless. And part of you has started wondering whether God has forgotten about your situation. But what if the very thing you're calling a delay is actually God's preparation? What if the closed door is protecting you? What if God is doing His greatest work in places you cannot see? Because throughout Scripture, God rarely worked according to human timelines. He worked according to perfect timing, and many of the blessings people celebrated later were being prepared during seasons they almost gave up on. So, before you assume nothing is happening, stay with me. Because the season you're trying to escape may be the very season God is using to prepare your future. While we focus on what hasn't happened yet, God is often preparing what comes next. He is shaping circumstances, developing character, strengthening faith, and arranging details that only make sense later. What feels like a delay to us may actually be divine preparation. One of the greatest challenges during seasons of waiting is learning how to respond when emotions take control. Waiting often affects more than our circumstances. It affects our relationships, our decisions, and even the way we see other people. Think about a relationship that has become strained. Maybe it's a friend you haven't spoken to in months. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding, an argument, or a disappointment that created distance between you. Then one day, a message appears on your phone. The person reaches out and suggests meeting for coffee. Immediately, conflicting emotions begin to surface. Part of you wants to reconnect. Another part wants to protect yourself. Old memories return. Unanswered questions reappear. You wonder whether reopening the conversation will bring healing or simply create new pain. Many people respond quickly in moments like this. Some answer immediately based on emotion. Others avoid responding altogether. Neither response is usually guided by wisdom. God often works in the space between the invitation and the response. That space gives us time to pray, reflect, and allow our emotions to settle before making a decision. Instead of reacting impulsively, take time to seek God's direction. Give yourself room to think clearly. Ask Him for wisdom. Let your response come from a place of peace rather than fear, hurt, or frustration. You may discover that waiting a few hours or even a day completely changes your perspective. Patience creates room for clarity. When life feels chaotic, remind yourself of simple truths. God is still in control. His timing is still perfect. Your emotions don't have to determine your decisions. And today's frustration doesn't have to become tomorrow's burden. Choose gratitude even when circumstances feel uncertain. Choose prayer when answers seem distant. Choose trust when understanding is limited. The people who grow strongest in faith aren't always those who receive immediate answers. Often, they are the ones who learn how to remain faithful while they wait. As you move through this week, remember that God knows exactly what He's doing. Nothing about your situation has taken Him by surprise. The delay you're experiencing may actually be the place where your faith is becoming stronger, your character is being refined, and your future is quietly being prepared. Sometimes the greatest lesson isn't learning how to move faster. It's learning how to trust God while standing still. There are seasons in life when God's silence feels more difficult than the problem itself. It's one thing to face a challenge. It's another thing to face a challenge while feeling as though heaven has gone quiet. You've prayed about the situation repeatedly. You've asked for direction. You've asked for clarity. You've asked for strength. Yet the answer you're hoping for doesn't seem to arrive. Days turn into weeks. Weeks become months. The silence remains. During these moments, many people begin questioning things they never questioned before. They wonder whether they're doing something wrong. They wonder whether God has forgotten them. They wonder whether their prayers are making any difference at all. But God's silence doesn't mean God's absence. In fact, some of the most important moments of spiritual growth happen when God appears to be silent. Think about a family gathering that didn't go as expected. Maybe a conversation became tense. Maybe old wounds resurfaced. Maybe someone said something hurtful that stayed in your mind long after the meal ended. Now you're standing alone in the kitchen cleaning up while everyone else has moved on. Part of you wants to explain yourself. Part of you wants to defend your position. Part of you wants the other person to understand exactly how much their words affected you. Yet deep inside, you sense that speaking immediately might only make things worse. The temptation to react is powerful. Most people feel an urgent need to clear up misunderstandings as quickly as possible. We want people to understand our intentions. We want to protect our reputation. We want to prove that we're right. But not every battle needs to be fought. Not every criticism requires an answer. Not every misunderstanding needs immediate correction. Sometimes silence is wisdom. Sometimes silence protects what words would damage. One of the hardest lessons faith teaches us is that restraint can be more powerful than reaction. When we refuse to speak out of anger, we're not surrendering. We're choosing self-control. We're allowing peace to remain where conflict would otherwise grow. God often works through moments of restraint. He softens hearts that arguments could never change. He creates understanding that endless explanations could never produce. And He brings clarity at the proper time. This doesn't mean we should never speak. There are times when conversations need to happen. There are times when truth needs to be expressed. There are times when healthy boundaries need to be established. But wisdom teaches us to choose the right moment. Timing matters. Words spoken at the wrong time can create damage that lasts for years. Words spoken at the right time can bring healing that lasts just as long. The world teaches us that strength means being louder, faster, and more aggressive. God often teaches the opposite. Real strength is remaining calm when emotions are demanding control. Real strength is maintaining peace when circumstances encourage conflict. Real strength is trusting God enough to know that you don't have to solve everything immediately. When you learn to embrace silence in the right moments, something begins to change inside you. Your emotions no longer control every decision. Your peace becomes less dependent on other people's behavior. Your confidence becomes rooted in God's presence rather than external circumstances. And eventually, you discover something surprising. The silence that once felt painful becomes a place where God speaks most clearly. Not always through words, not always through dramatic answers, but through wisdom, through conviction, through peace, through a deeper understanding that couldn't have been gained any other way. If you're in a season where God seems quiet, don't assume He isn't working. A seed grows underground long before it becomes visible above the surface. A foundation is built before the structure appears. And many of God's greatest blessings are prepared long before they arrive. Think about driving through a thick fog. You can't see 10 miles ahead. Sometimes you can't even see the next curve in the road. Yet you keep moving because you trust what's directly in front of you. Faith often works the same way. God rarely reveals the entire journey at once. Instead, He gives enough light for the next step, then the next one after that. Even when nothing seems to be changing, the story may be moving forward in ways you can't yet see. And often, the very silence that frustrates you today becomes the testimony that strengthens you tomorrow. As your faith continues to mature, you'll discover another truth. Faith isn't proven when everything is easy. Faith becomes strongest when uncertainty remains and you choose to trust God anyway. Because grace doesn't disappear when doubts appear. Grace remains, even in the middle of questions, even in the middle of waiting, even in the middle of silence. And that grace is often carrying you farther than you realize. Faith becomes most valuable when it's tested. Anyone can trust God when everything seems to be going well. It's easy to believe when prayers are answered quickly, relationships are healthy, finances are stable, and life feels predictable. The real challenge comes when circumstances begin to change. Maybe you've prayed for something important and nothing seems to be happening. Maybe you've been asking God for direction, yet every door remains closed. Maybe you're carrying a burden that nobody else fully understands. Those are the moments when doubt tries to find a place in your heart. Doubt rarely arrives all at once. It usually appears quietly. A question here, a disappointment there, a prayer that seems unanswered, a situation that takes longer than expected. Over time, those small moments can begin to wear down your confidence if you're not careful. But here's something important to remember. God's grace doesn't disappear when your faith feels weak. Many people assume they have to maintain perfect faith all the time. They think God is pleased only when they're strong, confident, and certain. That's not how grace works. Grace remains present even when you're struggling. Grace remains present when you're confused. Grace remains present when you're tired. And grace remains present when you're asking difficult questions. God understands every emotion you're experiencing. He isn't surprised by your fears. He isn't intimidated by your doubts. And He certainly doesn't abandon you when your faith feels smaller than it did yesterday. Think about how often we become impatient with people. A family member repeats the same mistake. A friend lets us down again. A coworker continues creating problems. Eventually, frustration begins to build. We start feeling exhausted. We start wondering whether anything will ever change. The same thing can happen in our relationship with God. Sometimes we become frustrated because His timing doesn't match ours. We want answers now. We want healing now. We want breakthrough now. We want clarity now. But God often works through processes rather than instant solutions. The reason is simple. God isn't only interested in changing circumstances, He's also interested in transforming people. Many of the qualities we pray for can only be developed through time. Most of the qualities we admire in other people weren't built during easy seasons. The calm person usually went through chaos. The wise person usually made mistakes. The patient person usually spent years waiting for something important. And the strongest people often became strong because life gave them no other choice. Growth rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it looks like ordinary days, quiet prayers, and small decisions to keep moving forward. And faith grows when we continue walking forward, even when we can't see the entire path ahead. Imagine scrolling through social media late at night. You come across a post that attacks your beliefs, criticizes your values, or mocks something that's deeply important to you. Immediately, you feel the urge to respond. Your mind starts preparing arguments. You want to correct every misunderstanding. You want to prove that they're wrong. You want the last word. But before you type a single sentence, pause for a moment. Ask yourself a simple question. Will this response create understanding, or will it simply create more conflict? Not every battle deserves your energy. Not every criticism deserves your attention. And not every argument deserves a response. Sometimes grace accomplishes more than winning an argument ever could. Sometimes walking away demonstrates more strength than staying and fighting. The world often confuses aggression with strength, but God sees things differently. True strength is remaining calm when everyone else is losing control. True strength is responding with wisdom when others react with emotion. True strength is refusing to let anger make decisions on your behalf. That's why gentleness should never be confused with weakness. A calm response can carry enormous power. A patient heart can influence people in ways that force never will. And a peaceful spirit often speaks louder than the strongest argument. As you continue moving through life's uncertainties, remember this. You don't have to carry every burden alone. You don't have to solve every problem immediately. And you don't have to understand everything before trusting God. Faith isn't the absence of questions. Faith is choosing to trust God even when some questions remain unanswered. That's where grace becomes so important. Grace reminds us that what feels still on the surface may actually be moving beneath it. Grace reminds us that failure isn't final. Grace reminds us that one difficult season doesn't define the rest of our story. And grace reminds us that God's love doesn't depend on perfect performance. His love remains constant. His presence remains constant. And His promises remain constant. Even when your emotions change, even when circumstances change, Even when your confidence rises and falls, God remains the same. That's why you can keep moving forward. Not because you have all the answers, not because everything makes sense, but because the one leading you can see what lies ahead. And that's enough reason to trust Him one more day. Sometimes one more day of trust becomes one more week. One more week becomes one more month. And before you realize it, you've made it through a season that once seemed impossible. Looking back, you'll see that God's grace carried you every step of the way. Even during the moments when you thought you were walking alone. One of the hardest things about waiting is that we usually don't know what God is doing while we're waiting. If we could see the entire plan, patience would be much easier. If we knew exactly when the answer was coming, we wouldn't struggle nearly as much. But faith has never been about seeing the whole picture. Faith is about trusting the one who does. Many people spend a large portion of their lives trying to force outcomes. They push harder, worry longer, overthink every detail, and exhaust themselves trying to control situations that were never meant to be controlled. The problem isn't that they lack effort. The problem is that they're carrying responsibilities that belong to God. There comes a point where wisdom says, I've done what I can do. Now I have to trust God with the rest. That's often where real peace begins. Imagine a parent praying for a son or daughter who has drifted away from faith. Every conversation feels delicate. Every decision feels important. Every silence feels heavy. Part of that parent wants immediate change. Part of them wants proof that their prayers are working. Part of them wants reassurance that everything will be okay. Yet month after month, sometimes year after year, visible change seems slow. This is where many people become discouraged. They start believing that nothing is happening because they can't see results. But some of God's greatest work happens beneath the surface. Just because growth isn't visible doesn't mean growth isn't happening. A seed spends a long time developing underground before anyone sees the first sign of life. Roots form before branches appear. Foundations are built before buildings rise. And God often works the same way. While we're looking for visible evidence, He may be strengthening something far deeper. He's preparing hearts. He's creating opportunities. He's arranging circumstances. He's teaching lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. Waiting becomes easier when we stop seeing it as wasted time. Because waiting isn't empty. Waiting is preparation. Waiting is development. Waiting is growth. The challenge is that growth rarely feels exciting while it's happening. Most growth feels ordinary. It happens during quiet mornings. It happens during routine prayers. It happens during long seasons when nothing dramatic seems to change. Yet those ordinary moments often shape extraordinary outcomes. If you've lived long enough, you've probably seen this happen before. Some of the greatest lessons you've learned probably didn't come during your easiest seasons. They came during difficult ones, and they came during seasons when you felt uncertain. They came during periods when you had no choice but to depend on God. At the time, you may have wished those seasons would end immediately. Now you can see that they produced something valuable. They strengthened your character. They deepened your faith. They taught you lessons that comfort never could. That's why God's timing often looks different from ours. We focus on immediate relief. God focuses on lasting transformation. We focus on getting through the situation. God focuses on who we're becoming while we go through it. And sometimes those two goals require different timelines. When you understand this, patience begins to take on a different meaning. Patience isn't passive. Patience isn't weakness. Patience isn't simply sitting around hoping something happens. Patience is active trust. It's choosing faith when fear offers an easier alternative. It's choosing hope when disappointment seems more reasonable. It's choosing peace while circumstances remain uncertain. And that kind of patience changes people. It changes the way you think. It changes the way you respond. It changes the way you view challenges. Instead of seeing every delay as a problem, you begin seeing some delays as preparation. Instead of assuming every closed door is rejection, you begin considering the possibility that God is providing protection. Instead of becoming discouraged by unanswered questions, you learn to trust that answers often arrive at the right time rather than the fastest time. This doesn't mean waiting suddenly becomes easy. There will still be days when you're frustrated. There will still be moments when you wonder how much longer you'll have to wait. There will still be times when your emotions try to convince you that nothing is changing. But that's exactly when faith matters most. Faith allows you to keep moving forward, even when certainty remains unavailable. Faith allows you to keep praying, even when answers seem delayed. Faith allows you to keep trusting when circumstances haven't caught up with God's promises yet. And over time, something remarkable happens. The thing you once viewed as an obstacle becomes part of your testimony. The season you wanted to escape becomes the season that taught you the most. The waiting that felt unbearable becomes proof that God was working all along. One day you'll look back and realize that what felt like a delay was actually divine timing. You'll see connections you couldn't see before. You'll understand lessons you couldn't understand before. And you'll recognize that God's wisdom was protecting and guiding you, even during the moments when you felt completely uncertain. That's why you don't have to fear the waiting season. Have you ever looked back on a season that once felt hopeless and realized that everything was quietly falling into place? At the time, nothing made sense. The waiting felt endless. The silence felt heavy. But later, you could see what you couldn't see then. Certain doors had to stay closed. Certain lessons had to be learned. Certain people had to leave. And certain opportunities needed more time before they were ready. What felt like a setback was often God's way of preparing something better than you could have planned yourself. Even now, while you wait, He is preparing something greater than you can currently imagine. Looking back, it's often easier to see why certain things had to happen the way they did. What once felt confusing eventually reveals its purpose. And above all, trust the God who never stops working, even when you can't see what He's doing. At some point in life, everyone encounters disappointment. Not the small disappointments that disappear after a day or two, but the kind that settles deep in the heart. The prayer that seemed unanswered. The relationship that didn't heal. The opportunity that slipped away. The person who never apologized. the dream that took far longer than expected. These moments can quietly wear down even the strongest people. The danger isn't always the disappointment itself. The danger is what disappointment can become if we allow it to remain unchecked. Disappointment can slowly become bitterness. Bitterness can become resentment. And resentment can eventually rob us of the peace God wants us to experience. That's why hope is so important. Hope isn't pretending everything is fine. Hope isn't denying pain. Hope isn't ignoring reality. Real hope looks directly at difficult circumstances and still believes God can bring something good from them. That's what makes hope powerful. Maybe there's someone whose name still brings tension into the room. Nobody talks about what happened anymore, but nobody has really moved on either. The conversations stay polite, the distance remains, and after enough time passes, it becomes easy to assume that nothing will ever change. Everyone remembers what happened. Everyone remembers who said what. Everyone carries their own version of the story. Time has passed, but healing hasn't come. Family gatherings feel uncomfortable. Conversations stay superficial. Certain topics are avoided completely. The distance remains. After enough time passes, it becomes easy to accept the situation as permanent. People begin believing that nothing will ever change. But God specializes in situations that seem impossible. Many of the greatest transformations begin after people have already given up expecting them. A hardened heart softens. An old conversation finally happens. Forgiveness appears where bitterness once lived. A relationship begins to heal. Not because someone forced the outcome, not because someone won an argument, but because God worked quietly beneath the surface. This is why hope matters. Hope keeps your heart open while God continues working. Without hope, we stop expecting anything good. Without hope, we become cynical. Without hope, we begin interpreting every situation through the lens of past disappointments. But hope allows us to believe that today's reality doesn't have to become tomorrow's destiny. Think about how often forgiveness is misunderstood. Many people assume forgiveness means pretending the pain never happened. Others believe forgiveness means approving of what someone did. Neither is true. Forgiveness is freedom. It's releasing the burden instead of carrying it forever. It's refusing to allow another person's actions to control your future. And sometimes forgiveness benefits the one who forgives even more than the one being forgiven. Holding on to resentment may feel justified for a while, but eventually it becomes exhausting. It drains emotional energy. It steals peace. It occupies mental space that could be used for something better. That's why God repeatedly calls us toward forgiveness, not because what happened was acceptable, but because He knows what unforgiveness eventually does to the human heart. Now imagine a different situation. You lie awake late at night, replaying a conversation that happened earlier in the day. You think about what you should have said. You think about what the other person should have done. You replay every detail again and again. Hours pass. Nothing changes. The problem remains exactly where it was. The only difference is that you've lost peace in the process. Many people spend years doing this emotionally. They continue fighting old battles long after the moment has passed. They continue carrying wounds that God wants to heal. They continue reliving painful memories that no longer have authority over their future. Hope invites us to do something different. Hope invites us to place the situation in God's hands, not because we're weak, not because we don't care, but because we recognize that God can accomplish things we can't. Some breakthroughs happen through action, others happen through surrender. Wisdom is knowing the difference. There are times when God asks us to speak. There are times when He asks us to move forward. And there are times when He asks us to trust Him enough to let go. That last one is often the hardest, because letting go feels like losing control. But the truth is that most of us never had control in the first place. We only had the illusion of it. God sees every detail, every hurt, every disappointment, every injustice, every silent prayer you've whispered when nobody else was around. Nothing has escaped His attention. Nothing has been forgotten. Nothing has been overlooked. And because of that, you can continue moving forward with confidence. Not confidence in people, not confidence in circumstances, not confidence in your own ability to predict the future. Confidence in God, the same God who carried you through previous challenges. The same God who provided when you didn't know how things would work out. The same God who remained faithful during seasons when your faith felt weak. He's still faithful today. And He's still writing your story. That's why hope remains alive, even when answers take longer than expected, even when healing moves slower than you'd like, even when circumstances seem unchanged. Hope remains because the story isn't over yet. What feels unfinished today may look very different a year from now. Sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't taking another step forward. Sometimes it's simply refusing to give up, refusing to become bitter, refusing to stop believing, refusing to let disappointment have the final word, because God always has the final word. And His plans are greater than anything disappointment could ever take away. One of the greatest gifts faith can give a person is peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from having every answer. Not the kind of peace that depends on perfect circumstances. And certainly not the kind of peace that appears only when life becomes easy. The peace God offers is different. It's the ability to remain steady when everything around you feels uncertain. It's the confidence that comes from knowing God is still in control, even when you don't understand what's happening. Many people spend years searching for peace in places that were never designed to provide it. They search for it in success. They search for it in money. They search for it in relationships. They search for it in achievements. For a while, those things may provide comfort. But sooner or later, circumstances change. Success comes and goes. Money rises and falls. People enter and leave our lives. Situations shift. When peace depends entirely on external things, peace becomes fragile. That's why God invites us to build our confidence on something deeper. He invites us to trust Him. Trust doesn't require complete understanding. In fact, trust often begins where understanding ends. There will always be situations you can't fully explain. There will always be questions that remain unanswered for a season. There will always be moments when God's plan seems unclear. The goal isn't to understand everything. The goal is to trust the one who does. Think about how much energy people spend trying to predict the future. We analyze possibilities. We imagine outcomes. We create scenarios in our minds. We prepare for problems that may never happen. And often, we carry stress over situations that don't even exist yet. Meanwhile, the present moment passes by. The peace available today gets replaced by worries about tomorrow. But God never asked us to carry tomorrow. He asks us to trust Him today. Today's grace is for today. Today's strength is for today. Today's peace is for today. When tomorrow arrives, God will provide what you need for tomorrow as well. That's why learning to live one day at a time is so important. It protects your heart from becoming overwhelmed by things you were never meant to carry. Imagine sitting with someone you love. They ask you a difficult question about faith. Maybe they want proof. Maybe they want certainty. Maybe they want answers that nobody can fully provide. You could spend hours trying to explain every mystery. You could attempt to answer every objection. You could search for the perfect argument. But sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't an argument. It's a life marked by peace, a life marked by kindness, a life marked by consistency, a life marked by trust in God. People may question your words. They may challenge your opinions. They may disagree with your conclusions. But it's much harder to ignore a life that's been transformed by faith. Peace becomes evidence. Patience becomes evidence. Grace becomes evidence. Love becomes evidence. Over time, those qualities speak louder than endless explanations ever could. That's why God often focuses on changing us before changing our circumstances, because transformed people become living testimonies, and transformed hearts influence the world around them. As you look back over your life, you'll probably notice something. Many of the things that once worried you never happened. Many of the fears that kept you awake eventually disappeared. Many of the situations that seemed impossible eventually worked themselves out. Not always in the way you expected, not always according to your timeline, but often in ways that revealed God's faithfulness. The same God who guided you through those seasons is guiding you through this one. The same God who opened doors before can open doors again. The same God who provided before can provide again. The same God who carried you through yesterday is carrying you today. And He'll carry you tomorrow. That's why you don't have to live in constant anxiety. You don't have to live controlled by fear. You don't have to live trapped by uncertainty. You can choose trust. You can choose faith. You can choose peace. Not because life is perfect, but because God is faithful. As we come to the end of this message, take a moment and reflect on your own journey. Think about the prayers you've prayed. Think about the challenges you've faced. Think about the seasons of waiting you've endured. Think about the moments when God seemed silent. Now think about how far He's already brought you. You're still here. You're still standing. You're still moving forward. And that alone is evidence of His faithfulness. The road hasn't always been easy. There were moments when you wanted to quit, moments when you felt discouraged, moments when you wondered whether things would ever change. Yet God remained with you through every one of them. He never abandoned you. He never stopped working. He never stopped caring. And He hasn't started now. Whatever you're waiting for today, place it in His hands. Whatever burden you've been carrying, give it to Him. Whatever fear has been stealing your peace, surrender it to Him. Trust that His timing is better than yours. Trust that His wisdom is greater than yours. Trust that His plan reaches farther than anything you can currently see. One day you'll understand things that seem confusing right now. One day you'll see connections that are invisible today. One day you'll recognize how God was working in places where you thought nothing was happening. Until then, keep trusting, keep praying, keep believing, keep moving forward, and keep remembering this truth. God is already in the future you're worried about. He's already present in the answers you're waiting for. The next chapter may already be closer than it appears. And because of that, you can rest, you can breathe, you can let go of the pressure to control everything. You can walk forward in confidence, knowing that the God who began a good work in your life will be faithful to complete it. May His peace guard your heart. May His wisdom guide your steps. May His strength sustain you through every season. And may your trust in Him grow deeper with every passing day. No matter what you're facing, you're never walking alone. God is with you, and one day you'll look back on this season with a completely different perspective. What feels uncertain now may eventually become one of the clearest examples of His faithfulness. His timing never fails. Amen.